Okay, so my talk is about what Jiu-Jitsu can teach us about handling dangerous ideas. Very conveniently follows on very nicely from the talk we just had. The quote at the top is from a guy called Joe Rogan, who's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, who described Jiu-Jitsu as high-level problem solving with dire physical consequences. And I'd like to think that at as a philosopher, that at the controversial end, we are partaking in high-level problem solving with the potential for dire consequences of an intellectual nature or even physical nature down the line. So I'd like to look at what learning about sort of this kind of problem in a physical situation such as Jiu-Jitsu can teach us about handling in an intellectual context. So firstly, the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu itself. It was invented by a guy called Helio Gracie, who was a very, very small, wiry man, who was interested in adapting Asian martial arts into a system of overcoming a stronger, heavier opponent, and did this through testing it against all sorts of different martial arts and becoming extremely successful at that. Then his eldest son, Rorion Gracie, contributed to the creation of the UFC in 1993. That was maths, oh dear. Which sort of was, and his thinking behind it was that getting this on a global stage and demonstrating the sport at that level would show its effectiveness, and they deliberately entered the smallest and not weakest necessarily, but certainly sort of most physically diminutive member of the family into that competition, and proceeded to win at least the first two events. It may have been more than that. Morgan?
And it became famous because the first one, you watch the first fight, and there's just this massive man against this like tiny little jiu-jitsu guy who just works wonders around.
And this continued for years until the events are still happening now, and it's got to a point where if you do not study jiu-jitsu as a sport, you become massively ineffective in a mixed martial arts context. There are rare exceptions to that, but largely that's the case. And then my first training session, and is partly what spurred my thinking for this, was being choked almost unconscious by a girl a foot shorter than me and half my weight. And that spurred my fascination with the sort of what at that point felt like absolute magic of this system. So one of the principles that's talked about by John Danaher, this rather scary looking bald man, is the asymmetry of the human body as far as how it's adapted to dealing with physical threats. So the technique being demonstrated here is a rear naked choke. John Danaher has an 8-hour-long instructional as to how exactly you could manipulate this position to your advantage, but also talks about how the human body is essentially asymmetrically developed to dealing with physical attacks. We're very, very well developed to deal with threats in front of us, but extremely poor at things behind us. And this is seen even at the highest levels of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition. There are two ways to win a match in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition. The first is by points, and the points are awarded for various techniques and positions, with two of the three highest scoring positions being controlling someone from behind. The points are awarded based on if you were allowed to strike, your ability to maintain your control while striking that opponent, causing them damage. The other is by submissions, and helpfully a husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Bishop, I can't remember their first names unfortunately, went through the entire 2012 World Championships, and largely this section is unimportant. This is the other way of winning, which is by submission. This section of the pie chart up to this 8% section are largely neutral positions. Side control mount and back are positions where the aggressor is in control, but even in this sense, controlling someone from behind outdoes by almost 50% any other method of control combined. So why this is important for us as philosophers is, for me, the problem with silencing dangerous ideas. or saying we shouldn't discuss this, or this should not be talked about. There is an intuition to silence. If we hear something that we disagree with, or we feel is potentially harmful, there is a very strong intuition to say this should not be shared. This is large. This is sort of a big umbrella, as Brian discussed and Martin has mentioned as well. There is a huge amount of context to this as to where is safe and where may not be. But now more than ever, to simply say no one should be allowed to discuss an idea because it's potentially harmful is problematic. Because the platforms, especially online, exist for such ideas to still permeate if people wish to find them. And the danger for me is that this creates an intellectual asymmetry in our ability to deal with the problems. In essence, where in Jiu-Jitsu, I'm doing everything that I could possibly muster through my techniques to stop someone from getting behind me. In silencing an idea, to essentially just go, I'm not interested in what you have to say. What you say is dangerous, is simply allowing them to discuss in their own forums, hidden away from things, and potentially cause harm. This is not necessarily in the sense that, I just want to be careful in the sense that this is not necessarily, with the spread of the idea itself, this is not necessarily 100%, I'm not entirely ruling out. My concern would be with the actual inflicting of physical harm. This is extremely problematic in the sense that the people who really want to can just go and do it hidden without enormous challenge, without us being able to sit and discuss these ideas. And I also think that this is a good demonstration of calmness, and this is something that's talked about a lot in the sport, is that so dangerous threats should be identified and their potential power respected. If you don't have a respect for the threat that an idea or technique can pose, you will not be well positioned in any sense to defend it. So in an ideal world, we would not wish to have to deal with someone posing a threat to us physically. We would not wish to have to deal with dangerous ideas in an ideal world. But we are far better placed if we are ready and prepared to deal with those in a calm, intellectual way with good reasoning than we are if we are just to simply put our hands up and ignore it altogether or stop them from talking entirely. Well, again, there's a subtlety to that. The precision beats power thing ties into my bottom point here, which is that we shouldn't underestimate people's willingness to accept good reasoning. There is a thought that if an idea is dangerous and simple, people may just flock to it and accumulate it. But if presented with good reasoning, I fear that there is an underestimation of people's willingness to say, that is a good argument in opposition to something. And I think we owe the respect to colleagues and society more widely to say, look, these are the ways in which we can properly prevent it. We would not wish to have to stop these ideas from potentially causing harm. But the way to do this is not simply by turning our backs and allowing them to potentially run riot in private, but to instead teach good. And again, the context of not necessarily exposing vulnerable people to problematic ideas at a young age or in a vulnerable situation, but to certainly promote a positive way of dealing with those in a well-reasoned, valid, sound way. So, thank you.
We're almost at the end, but if you have time, maybe you can stay for a few more minutes for the Q&A. If you need to leave to be somewhere else, just leave. Otherwise, questions.
Oscar.
Do you really think the general public can accept good reasoning? I'm quite dubious, but yeah. Sorry.
My dad's going to hate me for this, but this reminds me instantly whenever someone says something like that of something my dad always said to me, which is, imagine the person of sort of average, let's say, willingness to reason in this respect, and 50% of people are worse than that. I accept that that is a problem, but I fear that trying to put this in a polite fashion, amongst certain groups, especially at universities, the instantaneous response of saying the best way to deal with this is to stop it being talked about entirely and to say this is so dangerous that even good reasoning cannot rectify the situation, or an effective counter-argument, let's say, we cannot even allow it the possibility. That to me seems problematic. I would love to live in a world of, I like to have good faith about it. I'm aware that the reasoning rests on little more than that. I am aware of that, but I would like to hope, perhaps, but this is the point, is if it's shown that it doesn't, and this is hugely problematic, then this is where the context of deciding, as Ryan said, where particular ideas are discussed is important. You know, just throwing it out there, I'm not suggesting it's a particularly good idea. But I think there's certainly a danger, and this is where the context is important. I wouldn't like to paint a broad brush and say, let everyone talk about everything in every context.
So are you kind of trying to recommend that the general public needs to be trained in rationality and equanimity and responding to unorthodox kind of ideas? So that
I think in, sorry, will you finish? Sorry, I interrupted.
You know, like there's quite a good analogy when you start training. Like everyone's going, it's like this, people just going, wah, and then just going attacking with all their force, just going fucking, sorry, excuse me, just going mental, all right? And the opponent's there, just very relaxedly, just taking control of the situation and just destroying it. Basically, it takes a while, it takes a certain amount of training for you to be able to present in a tactical way, to be able to actually engage in some sort of thing. So you're saying that there needs to be a kind of, what are you trying to say, basically? That's the question, is whether there needs to be some sort of kind of intellectual training in the general public for there to be able to be some actual discussion, rather than just,
So I think that to propose the potential solution to this is there would be far less concern about the need to silence a dangerous idea if people were more aware, technically able and willing to engage in a rational, well-reasoned argument, and if this is promoted more widely, that really does have the potential to handle these ideas effectively, and not just sort of trying to sit and say, well, we should leave this to the most technically able. So say, in this room, we have a huge amount of exposure to this at a postgraduate philosophy level. Lots of people don't. But not but 2% of people who even start Jiu-Jitsu end up with a black belt at all. You know, but the point is even that beginning process is even a week on. We would know this from training, but even someone with a week's more experience than you, if that lesson happens to be, say, this rear naked choke, they will get you with it 95% of the times the week after they start. It's frightening. If we allow people more, not allow, but if we were to promote valid, sound reasoning and these principles, we had it in the first lecture of this course, where we're talking about valid reasoning, sound reasoning, and these are really important foundations upon which we can build these ideas.
Do you think it would retract from people wanting to present dangerous ideas, or do you think it would make people more able to present those dangerous ideas in a manner that would actually be efficient?
That's a very good point. It's a very good question.
Just to add to that point,
yeah.
this is something I think that might go back to Plato, which is that if you see it all as a kind of fight or a competition, the most skillful will win, rather than one with the most true position. So you're going to get like these rhetoric guys like Protagoras or what have you, who are just like, they're just so good at arguing and talking.
Does the analogy extend that far? I mean, are we saying that the winner of the fight therefore has a monopoly on truth and justice now, or are we saying that the techniques that are developed in terms of respect for your opponent, for understanding different types of forces are
beneficial?
Yeah.
I think there's, sorry.
No.
No, I think there is certainly a limit to this as there is in any analogy, and I wouldn't wish to say that the person who achieves the submission or the most point in an argument would be the person that wins it, but it's more in the, if we view this, if we take the mats away and put this outside a pub on Friday night, let's say, poor old Placido here's got a problem. We may not win the whole thing. It's not necessarily a who is right, who is wrong entire. We're striving for knowledge and truth and that kind of thing. But to at least prevent this. To prevent literally someone being able to strangle your position with their your intellectual position entirely, to have some way of, at least in part, presenting reasons, defence, would be of at least some benefit to, I realise that I'm now narrowing that down to, but of some benefit to countering.
I'll just add to that.
Yeah.
Each party would be able to pose their ideas in a manner that they're well developed, well argued, and they both exist kind of simultaneously, and you can kind of objectify them well.
Yeah, and this again speaks to that beginning of training is every sparring session to beginners is a fight. Yeah, and this is seen a lot as well in the discourse, is that for lots of people, especially those who haven't experienced debate particularly in an academic context, this becomes this side fight.
Yeah. There is no discussion.
Whereas actually, flow rolling particularly is something which is just an exchange of techniques back and forth to see where we go to find the best path through this and a positive outcome. And I think that, like I say, the more people that can be exposed to the techniques of intellectual reason or philosophy and ideas of how we reason effectively, validly, soundly, can only be positive in taking away from the discussion of opposing ideas being simply a fight and more of a debate, let's say.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And